Hi, my name is David, and in today's lecture, we're going to be going over the basics on how to make a good summary in debate. We're going to be going over the general tasks you have to do, what you should do in each of those steps, a general order, and how much time you should spend on each step. And then finally, we'll end off with a drill where you can practice the skills that you've learned in this lecture. So let's get started. The first thing, what is the summary? In each debate round, the summary is going to be the third speech that occurs. It's going to be made by the first speaker. It's going to be 3 minutes long. Typically, the speech is very important. If you're giving the first summary speech, this is going to be the first chance that you have to respond to your opponent's arguments that they make in their rebuttal. And if you're the second summary, your job is also important since you want to try to summarize and encapsulate the round so that it's easier for the judge to understand where they're going to be voting, what arguments you're winning, and what key fundamental mistakes that your opponent has made. So overall, in most rounds, especially at the highest level, the summary is going to make or break the round. And if a summary is good, it can usually win the round, and a bad summary will usually doom the team. All right, so now that we know the general topic of what the summary is, let's go over the steps you have to do. So in each summary, there's essentially five key steps. First, before the speech, you and your partner want to talk about what you want to collapse on. Collapsing in this case just means picking which one of your arguments has the least responses to it, or which one of your arguments is the best. After you have decided this before the speech, during your speech, you want to extend that argument or extend that case. What that essentially means is if you have one contention that might be maybe 300 or 400 words, when you extend it, you want to kind of summarize that one argument in 100 words. Following the step of extensions, you also have to do what we call frontlining. In this case, frontlining is just defending that argument. For example, if I want to collapse on argument C, my opponent reads 4 responses on argument C, the frontlining would be me responding to each of the 4 responses that my opponents make on argument C. And then the next main thing that you want to do is going to be weighing. What weighing is you just assume that your opponent wins their argument. You want to tell the judge why the argument that you collapsed on has the most important impact. We'll go more in depth on this later in the slideshow, but weighing in this case would be using traditional mechanisms such as scope, like my impact affects more people, magnitude, my impact affects more people, and then time frame, which is just saying that my impact happens before theirs, so therefore you should evaluate it more. We're going to go more in depth into each of these 5 steps, but this is just a general overview on what you want to try to accomplish in that 3-minute period. So now let's start with the first step. The first step is collapsing. In general, a good analogy that I like to use for teaching what collapsing is it's kind of like a funnel. At the start of each debate round, both teams have typically 4 minutes to give all of their arguments. And then as the debate continues on, each speech has less and less time. Essentially, what you want to do when you collapse is you want to try to funnel the round. It's going to be impossible to respond to every single argument. It's going to be impossible to go for every argument. Therefore, collapsing is really important. You want to especially choose one argument that you want to go for, and you really want to flush it out. This is really advantageous in 2 ways. One, if you choose just one argument to go for, it's a lot more easy to respond to the responses that your opponents make in a timely manner. And second of all, especially if your parent might be a lay judge or they might not be a very technical judge, choosing just one argument will make sure they aren't overwhelmed. And more importantly, they know at the end of the day what main point you want to kind of present. So as listed on the slideshow here, the main goal of collapsing is creating a clear ballot. You want to make sure the judge understands what the most important argument in the round is. That's going to be the argument that you collapse on. And then in general, when you want to choose which argument you want to collapse on, some kind of criteria that you can use is typically what me and my partner did is we just picked the largest impact of that contention. So for example, if contention 3 affected 100 million people, contention 2 only affected 10 million people, we typically pick contention 3. But another important criteria that you want to do is maybe a contention that has less responses. So for example, even if contention 3 might have a much larger impact, your opponent might have spent maybe 2 minutes on that contention just responding to it. Meanwhile, on another contention, even if the impact is smaller, they might have read 0 responses towards that. In this case, you want to kind of choose the path of least resistance. You don't want to do as much work, so you just want to pick the contention that has the least responses to it. In this case, not only can you say that your opponents forgot to respond to it, but also it's a lot more clear at the end of the day what you're going to go for, and it's a lot clearer in the judge's mind. Another interesting thing you can try to do on collapsing, this is typically more risky, but if you and your partner, for example, wrote out one really strong contention and the other 2 contentions are kind of filler, you already know before the round that you want to collapse for this argument. That's more advantageous because you can, for example, pre-prepare extensions and you already kind of know going into your summary what argument you're going to go for. So picking a predetermined contention is also a good strategy if you and your partner are very confident at defending the argument and winning that argument. All right, now that we've talked about what collapsing is, which is just picking your best argument, let's see what you have to do from here. The next main step you want to do is frontlining. So in this case, you want to defend the argument that you collapsed on from your opponent's responses. At the end of the day, even if you only pick one main point, if you don't respond to your opponent's responses, the judge will most likely not buy it. That's why frontlining is a very important part of the summary. Other than weighing, I'd say this is the part where most rounds can probably end if the summary doesn't do a good job frontlining. In this case, what you want to do is you want to make sure you write down all the responses that your opponent made, and you want to go down either line by line, answering each individual response. You want to try to group the responses up and respond to them overall. At the end of the day, no matter how you tackle this task, you want to make sure you respond to all of your opponent's refutations that they made. If you don't do this, then your opponents will most likely go up in their summary and just say, oh, there's one key flaw with their argument here. They didn't respond to what we have to say here. For these reasons, you can't vote for their argument. Frontlining is very important since you want to make sure your case is iron tight. So when you eventually go for that contention and when you go for that argument, it is very, very easy to persuade the judge, as there's no way that your opponents can possibly bring up any nooks or crannies. So in this, frontlining is probably a very important step, and you want to try to practice this, especially if you predetermine what argument you're collapsing for, because if you don't do a good job frontlining, you most likely won't win your argument. There will be more practice on this later in the slideshow, but I'd say this is the main part that probably takes the most practice to do, since it might be hard to respond to responses on the fly, but also it's the easiest to practice and get better at. And as you do more and more rounds, this is a task that will get a lot easier. Okay, now that we know what argument we're going to collapse on and how to defend the argument, let's see what the next step is. In this case, the next step is going to be extending. Since you only have 3 minutes for summary, you don't have time to essentially read the whole contention over again. So what debaters typically do, and what's the best strategy here, is you want to kind of summarize that contention. For example, maybe the contention might be 300 words and there's a lot of sources and evidence that you use, but there's also a lot of filler words. In this case, extending is important since you want to save time. In this case, extending would be summarizing that contention, maybe 60 or 70 words. Instead of including maybe 8 sources, you only include 2 or 3 sources. And then overall, you want to make sure the overall theme and message of the argument is not lost. Extending essentially saves you a ton of time while still making sure that the argument that you're going for and the main idea that you want to present to the judge in the round isn't lost. If you don't extend in both summary and final focus, if you don't summarize your argument again, most technical judges will automatically not vote for it. And especially if it's a parent judge, they might be extremely lost on how you're kind of going from point to point. So extending is another very important part of the summary process, and you have to do it if you want to try to win the round later. All right, now that you know what argument you want to pick and what responses to respond to, now that we also know how to summarize the argument, the next step is going to be weighing. And weighing is the most important. No matter how much you win your case by, even if the judge buys your argument completely, if you don't do weighing, if you don't compare why your impact is more important than the opponent's impact, you will still frequently lose. That's why even at the highest level, most teams only focus on their case and try to win the weighing. At the end of the day, you can actually read 0 responses to your opponent's case. As long as you prove that your impact is more important than any of their impacts, you still win the round. There's going to be more in-depth lectures on weighing later, and you can find it in the prep share folder. I'd say weighing is the most important part of the summary. This is essentially why the judge is going to vote for you and why your overall argument actually matters in the grand scope of things. So now we'll go over a couple of brief weighing mechanisms on how you can actually kind of differentiate which impact is more important than their impact. So overall, we covered this earlier, but scope is going to be essentially the range that your impact affects. So for example, if my opponent's impact only affects a certain state, but my impact affects the whole nation of the United States, my impact outweighs on scope. I'm affecting a wider range of people, so that's going to be a more significant impact. Next is pretty similar to scope. That's what we like to call magnitude. Magnitude is just the sheer number of people that your impact affects. For example, let's say my opponent's impact affects 100,000 people, but my impact affects 5 million people. Obviously, my impact would outweigh on magnitude because I'm affecting more people in total. And then another common mechanism that's used is going to be time frame. And time frame in this case is just saying when that impact actually triggers or when it occurs. So a good example that I like to think of is a time frame of, for example, a nuclear war, but would actually be very low because the moment a nuke is launched, there's a good chance that there's going to be other countries launching their own nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, an argument with a very low time frame would probably be something like climate change. Even though we see the signs happening, it will most likely take several hundreds of years for climate change to actually happen. So to actually happen and see devastating impacts. In this case, something like a war would have a much shorter time frame, so it can happen much sooner. And then finally, another common mechanism that most teams use is probability. It's the actual likelihood of an impact sort of triggering. So in this case, the opposite is actually true. Climate change probably has a 100% probability because we can already see it happening today. Meanwhile, an argument like nuclear war would probably have a very low probability. For example, a chance of a nuclear war actually happening is probably significantly lower than, for example, the ice caps melting and things like that. In this case, nuclear war would have a lot lower probability and would be the less significant impact. In this case, we can already see with just 4 weighing mechanisms, you can already see how you can kind of differentiate and see which impact is the most important. And in your summary, you want to make sure you focus on doing the weighing and telling the judge why no matter what happens, your impact is more important. All right, now that we know how to compare our impacts against our opponent's impact, let's look at an overall flowchart of what you want to do in the summary. So essentially, this is kind of how you want to allocate the 3 minutes that you have in your summary speech. First of all, you can either spend, you want to spend 10 seconds at the start of summary, essentially choosing an argument and saying, and giving a topic sentence or just a brief point on why you want to vote there. So for an example, one way I could start a summary is saying, at the end of the day, the most important argument is our argument on debt. That would be essentially collapsing, and the judge knows that at the end of the day, the argument that you're going to be going for is a debt argument. Following this collapsing process, you immediately want to go to frontlining. You want to defend the point that you've kind of put all the eggs in the basket in. You want to try to defend that point and make sure it's as iron tight as possible. So you want to look over all of the responses that your opponent has said on this contention. You want to refute them all to the best of your ability. After you do the frontlining process, as we talked before, you want to summarize the argument. You don't have time to read the whole thing word for word, so you want to kind of summarize it in just 100 words, so at least it's manageable. In this part, as shown at the top, each of these sections have their own timestamps, but if you actually are good enough at extensions, it typically won't take 30 seconds. You can probably get them done in 20 seconds. But then, once again, the most important part of your summary is going to be weighing. While this chart might be a little outdated, I'd say you actually want to spend maybe a minute or even a minute 15 seconds on weighing, since it's so important. At the end of the day, you don't even have to respond to the arguments your opponents make. If you can weigh and prove that your impact is more important than your opponent's impact, you've already won the round. So I'd actually say weighing is more important than actually responding to your opponent's case at this state of the round. If you can weigh well, and if your argument is very clear and your impact is the largest in the round on several criteria, you've already won the round. But then, even if that isn't enough, and it typically won't be in a very close round where teams are evenly matched, you also want to extend responses made by your partner in rebuttal. In this case, you'd be wanting to extend things like D-links or maybe non-uniques on the impact that on the contention that your opponent collapsed on. So for example, if my opponent went for an argument on climate change, I want to extend responses such as, oh, climate change is inevitable, it's always going to happen. Or you can extend something like a non-unique saying that, oh, other countries will solve for climate change. It's not a problem that my opponents uniquely solve. So overall, if you want more time, you can just, once again, just look at the structure before any of your summaries. Or if you're just starting out, you should just try to look at the structure as just a basic foundation on how you want to kind of structure what you're saying at what time. All right, and then now let's go over some just extra notes on how, maybe in some unique scenarios, how you want to kind of adjust your summary. So overall, I'll start off with the most important thing. If your opponents you think are winning the round, you always want to cover their case before yours. Here's why. If you think that your opponent is winning their argument, you want to cover the most important argument in the round. So in this case, you might want to read some sort of defense or read responses to their case first. And then overall, I'd say as a general rule of thumb, you cannot say new information or new arguments in second summary. Typically, judges won't evaluate it, so just stay away from that overall. And then adding on to that, you also can't say any new front lines in second summary. You can only say things that your partner has already said in second rebuttal. And then last but not least, you don't want to read responses to arguments that your opponent isn't going for. This kind of refers to the extensions on your opponent's arguments. You're extending other responses. But in general, if your opponents aren't collapsing on that contention, don't waste time reading more responses to it. It's just wasting your time. You're spreading yourself more thin. And instead, you can kind of allocate that time to kind of strengthening your own arguments. All right. Now here, if you have time and if you're still following along, here are just two links where you can practice frontlining the argument and extending the argument. And then if you really want, you can also send a recording to any one of the officer's messengers, and that will be good to go. Overall, I hope you learned the basics of summary, and I hope you've improved your skills. And yeah, see you next time.